The small town of Meridian Creek sat nestled between rolling hills and a winding river, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Or at least, they thought they did. For as long as anyone could remember, Elder Tobias Montgomery had been the face of respectability in their community. His passing at the age of 78 had cast a shadow over the entire town. The news spread quickly on that Monday morning. Mrs. Lynn from the bakery told Mr. Patel at the gas station, who mentioned it to the school bus driver, who announced it to every parent at the morning drop-off. By noon, the church bells had rung and black ribbons appeared on doorways throughout the main street. Such a shame, people whispered as they passed each other. He was a good man. Tobias Montgomery had owned the only pharmacy in town for nearly 50 years. The white building with its green awning stood at the corner of Main and Oak, a landmark as familiar as the town square itself. Inside, behind the counter, he had dispensed not just medicine but advice, comfort, and occasionally stern warnings to generations of townspeople. "Take these twice a day," he would say, handing over a paper bag of pills. "And remember to say your prayers." His customers would nod, knowing that Elder Montgomery's wisdom extended beyond medical matters. Every Sunday he sat in the front pew of the First Community Church, his silver hair combed neatly, his suit pressed without a wrinkle. After services, he would stand at the door alongside Pastor Williams, shaking hands and asking after people's health, their children, their troubles. "The Lord provides," he would remind them, his deep voice carrying the weight of authority. His home was a large colonial house on Cherry Blossom Lane, set back from the road behind a row of ancient oak trees. The grass was always the perfect height, the flower beds bursting with color from spring through autumn. In winter, his Christmas lights display was the most elegant in town, white lights outlining the windows and doors, a single candle in each window. Nothing flashy, just tasteful, like the man himself. What few people knew was that Elder Montgomery had his own special garden behind the house, hidden from view by tall hedges. Here he grew plants that weren't just for show, herbs, and flowers with properties not found in his pharmacy's inventory. And beneath the garden shed, accessible only through a trapdoor disguised under a workbench, was a room that no one in Meridian Creek knew existed. No one except his granddaughter, Amara. The news of her grandfather's death reached Amara in a city hundreds of miles away. She sat at her kitchen table staring at the text message from her aunt. "Your grandfather passed last night. Funeral on Friday." 15 years had passed since Amara had set foot in Meridian Creek. 15 years since she had fled in the middle of the night, leaving behind frantic accusations that no one believed. "He keeps creatures in the dark," she had told her parents, her voice shaking. "He talks to them. They move when he tells them to." Her parents had exchanged worried glances. "Honey, you're having nightmares again," her mother had said. Elder Montgomery is a good man, everyone knows that. But Amara knew what she had seen. She had been 13 that summer, staying with her grandfather while her parents took a second honeymoon. One night, unable to sleep because of the heat, she had wandered outside. The light from beneath the garden shed had caught her attention. The memory still made her skin crawl, the sound of hissing, the strange words her grandfather was chanting, the smell of something ancient and wrong. Now, as a woman of 28, Amara wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, trying to warm fingers that had suddenly gone cold. Her grandfather was dead. The man whose shadow had loomed over her life even from a distance was gone. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt a pulling sensation, as if a thread connected her to Meridian Creek, tugging her back. There was unfinished business there, secrets that needed to come to light. "I won't go," she whispered to her empty apartment. But 3 days later, she found herself packing a small suitcase. She chose plain clothes, black pants, a simple blouse, flat shoes, nothing that would draw attention. Her curly hair was pulled back in a tight bun. Large sunglasses would hide her eyes, which people had always said were too intense, too questioning. The drive to Meridian Creek took 4 hours. With each mile, Amara felt the weight of memories pressing down on her. The town hadn't changed much. The same storefronts lined Main Street, though some names had changed. The pharmacy still stood at the corner, though the sign now read Montgomery and Sons, even though her grandfather had never had a son, only daughters. She checked into the only motel on the edge of town, giving a fake name. She wasn't ready to announce her return. Not yet. That evening, Amara drove slowly past her grandfather's house. The porch light was on, and cars were parked along the street. Family gathering to mourn, she supposed. She didn't stop. Instead, she drove to the end of Cherry Blossom Lane where it met the old country road. There she parked and walked to a small clearing in the woods. This had been her hiding place as a child, where she came when her grandfather's stern voice and strict rules became too much. The old oak tree still stood, its branches stretching out like protective arms. Amara leaned against its trunk and looked up at the stars, barely visible through the leaves. "I came back," she whispered. "Not for him. For me." A breeze rustled the leaves, and somewhere in the distance an owl hooted. Amara closed her eyes, listening to the night sounds. For the first time in 15 years, she allowed herself to really remember. The hidden basement room, the glass cases lining the walls, the creatures that slithered and crawled inside them, the books with strange symbols, and her grandfather's voice changed somehow, speaking words that seemed to make the air itself shiver. In 2 days, they would bury Elder Tobias Montgomery. The town would mourn a pillar of the community, a godly man, a helper and healer. Only Amara knew the truth, and as she stood in the darkness, she made a decision. She would attend the funeral. She would watch as they lowered her grandfather into the ground. And then perhaps she would finally be free of the nightmares, the fear, and the anger that had shaped her life. What she didn't know was that her grandfather had made preparations for his death, preparations that involved his secret collection, and those preparations were about to go terribly wrong. The next morning, Amara woke early. The funeral was still a day away. She had time to gather her courage. As she sipped her coffee at a small diner, careful to keep her sunglasses on despite being indoors, she overheard conversations at nearby tables. Never missed a Sunday in 40 years. Donated the land for the new playground. Knew exactly what medicine you needed before you even told him what was wrong. Amara's hand tightened around her mug. The good Elder Montgomery, the town's saint. If only they knew, but they would. Soon they would all know. Because some secrets refuse to stay buried, even when the one who kept them is gone. The day of the funeral arrived with a sky so blue it seemed disrespectful. The summer heat pressed down on Meridian Creek like a heavy blanket, making the black clothes of mourners even more uncomfortable. By 10 in the morning, the temperature had already climbed to 85 degrees, and the air conditioning at Peaceful Rest Funeral Home struggled to keep up with the crowd. Amara sat in her motel room, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Dark circles shadowed her eyes after a night of restless sleep. Nightmares had chased her through the darkness, visions of glass cases shattering, of things that slithered and crawled, of her grandfather's voice changing into something inhuman. Just get through today, she told herself, applying a light coat of lipstick with a shaking hand. Then you can leave this place forever. She chose her outfit carefully, a simple black dress, modest but not expensive. Nothing that would draw attention. Her curly hair was pulled back again, and her large sunglasses sat ready on the dresser. She didn't want to be recognized, didn't want the whispers and stares that would come when people realized that the wayward granddaughter had returned. The drive to the funeral home took only 5 minutes, but to Amara, it felt like crossing an ocean. She parked behind the building, away from the main lot where people gathered in small groups talking in hushed voices. From her car, she watched them, the familiar faces of her childhood, now older, some almost unrecognizable. Mr. Chen from the hardware store, now walking with a cane. Mrs. Diaz, the school principal, her hair completely white. Pastor Williams, still tall and straight-backed despite having to be well into his 70s by now. Amara waited until everyone began filing inside before she left her car. She slipped through a side door and found a seat in the last row as far from the front as possible. From here, she could see everything without being seen. The funeral home's largest viewing room was packed. Flowers covered every available surface. Arrangements of lilies, roses, and carnations filling the air with a sweetness that couldn't quite mask the smell of embalming chemicals. At the front of the room, flanked by sprays of white flowers, sat the casket. It was closed now, though Amara knew there had been a viewing the previous evening. She hadn't gone to that. She couldn't bear to see his face, even in death. The casket gleamed under the lights, dark polished wood with gold handles, expensive and dignified, just as her grandfather would have wanted. Amara wondered briefly who had chosen it. Her mother, perhaps, or one of her aunts. She hadn't spoken to any of them since leaving town. Pastor Williams stepped to the podium as the organist finished playing a hymn. The room fell silent. "We gather today," he began, his voice deep and resonant, "to celebrate the life of Elder Tobias Montgomery, a man of faith, of service, and of unwavering principles." Amara's hands clenched in her lap. Principles. Right. For over 40 years, Tobias served this community. He healed our bodies with his knowledge of medicine and our souls with his wisdom and faith. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Amara bit the inside of her cheek, tasting blood. He was a pillar of our church, a devoted father and grandfather and a friend to all who sought his counsel. Not all, Amara thought, not me. The eulogy continued, painting a picture of a man Amara barely recognized, a saint, a hero, a beacon of moral strength. Around her, people nodded, dabbed at their eyes, reached for the hands of those sitting beside them. They believed every word. Why wouldn't they? They had never seen what lurked beneath the floorboards of his garden shed. They had never heard the hissing voices that responded when he chanted in the dark. After Pastor Williams finished, a parade of community members came forward to share memories of Elder Montgomery. Mrs. Patel from the post office talked about how he had helped her son get a scholarship. Old Mr. Bennett recalled how the elder had kept his pharmacy open late one night during a snowstorm to provide medicine for Bennett's wife. Even the mayor spoke, announcing that the new wing of the community center would be named after Tobias. Montgomery Amara felt as if she were drowning in a sea of lies. Each story, each tearful recollection pushed her further down, making it harder to breathe. She wanted to stand up, to scream the truth, to ask if their beloved elder had also kept venomous creatures in hidden rooms and whispered to them in ancient tongues. But she remained silent, her fingernails digging half-moons into her palms. As the service progressed, Amara noticed something odd. Despite the air conditioning, the room seemed to be getting hotter. People were fanning themselves with the funeral programs. A woman 2 rows ahead kept wiping her forehead with a handkerchief. Even Pastor Williams paused once to dab at his brow with a tissue. But it wasn't just the heat. There was something else. A subtle change in the air, a tension that hadn't been there before. Amara felt it like a pressure against her skin, making the tiny hairs on her arms stand up. It reminded her of summer evenings before a thunderstorm, when the atmosphere grew heavy with anticipation. Her eyes were drawn to the casket. Was it her imagination, or had there been a sound? A soft thump, perhaps, or a scratch. No one else seemed to have noticed. Her Uncle Thomas was at the podium now, his voice breaking as he spoke about his father's generosity and kindness. Amara leaned forward slightly, her heart suddenly racing. There it was again. A faint sound coming from the casket, like something moving inside. She glanced around, but no one else was reacting. They were all focused on Uncle Thomas, who was now showing a photograph of her grandfather standing proudly in front of his pharmacy on its opening day. The heat in the room intensified. Amara felt sweat trickling down her back. Her mouth was dry. She reached for her water bottle but found it empty. The pressure in the air continued to build, making it difficult to concentrate on anything but the casket at the front of the room. Uncle Thomas finished his remembrance and returned to his seat. Pastor Williams stepped forward again, announcing that they would now have a moment of silence to reflect on Elder Montgomery's life before proceeding to the cemetery for the burial. The room grew quiet. In that silence, the sound was unmistakable, a scratching, sliding noise coming from within the polished wood casket. This time, Amara wasn't the only one who heard it. A woman in the front row, Aunt Helen, Amara guessed, turned her head toward the casket, a look of confusion crossing her face. The funeral director, who had been standing discreetly at the side of the room, took a step forward, then hesitated. The scratching grew louder. Then came a new sound, a soft hiss that seemed to fill the entire room. Someone gasped. Pastor Williams paused in his prayer, opening his eyes to look toward the casket. Amara felt frozen in place, her body refusing to move even as her mind screamed at her to run. She knew what was coming. Somehow, deep in her soul, she had always known that her grandfather's secrets wouldn't stay buried with him. The first thin crack appeared along the seam of the casket lid, barely visible from where Amara sat. But what emerged from that crack was visible to everyone, a small, dark shape that slithered out and onto the polished surface of the casket, its scales gleaming under the funeral home lights. And it wasn't alone. Time seemed to stop as the small snake slithered across the polished surface of the casket. Its body was thin, no thicker than a pencil, with scales that shimmered between black and dark green in the funeral home lights. For one breathless moment, no one moved. No one spoke. It was as if everyone doubted what they were seeing. Then a woman in the second row screamed. The sound broke whatever spell had held the room frozen. Suddenly, everyone was moving at once. People jumped to their feet, pushing past each other to get to the exits. Someone knocked over a flower arrangement, sending a vase crashing to the floor. Water spread across the carpet like a stain. "Please remain calm," Pastor Williams called out, but his voice was lost in the growing chaos. More snakes were appearing now, wiggling through the small gap where the casket lid had begun to separate from its base. They poured out like a living stream, some thick as a man's wrist, others delicate as shoelaces. They were followed by darker shapes that scuttled rather than slithered, scorpions, their curved tails held high and ready. The funeral director rushed forward, then backed away again, his face drained of color. He bumped into a table, sending another flower arrangement toppling. His assistant appeared in a doorway, took one look at the scene, and ran. Amara hadn't moved from her seat. Unlike everyone else, she wasn't surprised, only sickened by the confirmation of what she had always known. Her grandfather's creatures had come to say goodbye, or perhaps they had come for something else. From her position at the back of the room, she could see everything. The panicked crowd pushing toward the doors, the creatures continuing to emerge from the casket, and something else that made her blood run cold. The lid of the casket was moving, rising slowly as if pushed from within. Officer Luis Reyes had been sitting near the middle of the room. He was off duty, attending the funeral out of respect for Elder Montgomery, who had once helped his mother through a difficult illness. Now, as chaos erupted around him, his training kicked in. Instead of running for the exits, he moved toward the front of the room, toward the source of the panic. "Everybody stay back," he shouted, his hand instinctively going to his hip where his service weapon would normally be, but he wasn't carrying today. This was a funeral, not a patrol shift. The crowd thinned as more people escaped through the doors. Those who remained were either too frightened to move or too curious to leave. Amara watched as Officer Reyes approached the casket, his steps slowing as he got closer to the writhing mass of creatures that now covered its surface and were beginning to spread to the floor. "Don't touch them," Amara called out, finding her voice at last. "Some of them are venomous." Officer Reyes glanced back at her, eyes widening with recognition. "Amara? Amara Montgomery?" She stood up, removing her sunglasses. There was no point in hiding now. "Yes, and those creatures belong to my grandfather." A murmur went through the remaining onlookers. Mrs. Diaz, the school principal, stepped forward. "What are you talking about, child? Why would Elder Montgomery have these things?" She gestured at the snakes and scorpions now spreading across the floor, causing the few remaining mourners to climb onto chairs. "Because he wasn't who you thought he was," Amara said, moving carefully toward the front of the room, keeping her eyes on the floor to avoid stepping on any of the creatures. "He kept them in a hidden room, He used them for rituals. That's ridiculous, Uncle Thomas sputtered from where he stood pressed against the wall. My father was a man of God. He wouldn't. His words cut off as the casket lid suddenly flew, open with a force that shouldn't have been possible. More creatures poured out, not just snakes and scorpions now, but also spiders as big as a child's hand, their hairy legs scrambling for purchase on the slick wood. Officer Reyes jumped back, nearly losing his balance. What in heaven's name? Amara had reached the front row now. She could see inside the casket. What she saw made her stop in her tracks. Oh no, he actually did it. Beneath her grandfather's body, visible now that so many creatures had escaped, was a false bottom to the casket. It had partially slid open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside were things that had no place at a funeral. Strange symbols painted in what looked like blood, small cloth dolls with pins stuck through them, and a book bound in what Amara feared wasn't leather. He prepared himself, she whispered, just like he always said he would. The few people still in the room were staring at the open casket in horror. Amara's Aunt Rose had fainted, slumping against Uncle Thomas. Pastor William stood with his prayer book clutched to his chest, his face ashen. Officer Reyes had taken out his phone and was calling for backup. Everyone needs to leave, he ordered, his voice steady despite the situation. Now. This is a crime scene. It's more than that, Amara said quietly. It's proof. As if in response to her words, the temperature in the room plummeted. Despite the summer heat outside, their breath suddenly became visible in the air. The lights flickered, once, twice, then stabilized. Officer Reyes looked at Amara, his professional calm starting to crack. What's happening? The ritual wasn't completed properly, she replied, surprised at how calm she felt. The fear that had haunted her for 15 years was being replaced by a strange, cold clarity. He needed to be buried with his creatures, with his tools. They were supposed to protect him in death, guide him to wherever he thought he was going. A small snake slithered across her shoe. Amara didn't flinch. But something went wrong. At that moment, the overhead lights exploded, showering the room with glass. Darkness fell, broken only by the red glow of exit signs. In that dim light, the creatures seemed to be gathering, forming, a pattern on the floor around the casket. Officer Reyes grabbed Amara's arm. We need to get out of here now. She nodded, allowing him to pull her toward the exit. The few remaining mourners were already rushing through the doors. Behind them, in the darkened room, the temperature continued to drop. Frost began to form on the windows despite the summer heat outside. As they reached the doorway, Amara looked back one last time. In the red glow of the exit sign, she could see something rising from the casket. Not her grandfather's body, but a shadow that seemed darker than the darkness around it. A shape that twisted and changed as it grew. Run, she whispered. They burst through the funeral home doors into the blinding sunlight. Outside, chaos reigned. Mourners were scattered across the parking lot, some crying, others talking frantically on phones. Emergency vehicles were already arriving, sirens wailing. Officer Reyes kept hold of Amara's arm, guiding her to a police car where his chief was getting out. Sir, he called, you're not going to believe what's happening in there. The police, chief looked past them to the funeral home, where windows were now frosting over from the inside despite the 90-degree heat. Try me, he said grimly. Amara took a deep breath. After 15 years of silence, of not being believed, the time had come to tell her story. And this time, there was evidence no one could ignore. My grandfather was not who you thought he was, she began. And what's in that building now is just the beginning. The next 24 hours in Meridian Creek were unlike anything the small town had ever experienced. Police cars and emergency vehicles lined the streets around Peaceful Rest Funeral Home. People gathered behind yellow tape, whispering to each other, sharing wild theories about what had happened inside. Some claimed it was a prank gone wrong. Others whispered about signs and omens. None of them knew the truth. Not yet. Amara sat in an interview room at the police station, a foam cup of cooling coffee on the table in front of her. She had been talking for hours, telling her story to Police Chief Rivera and Officer Reyes. She told them about finding the hidden room beneath the garden shed when she was 13. She described the glass cases full of creatures, the strange books written in languages she didn't recognize, the chanting she had heard late at night. "I tried to tell my parents," she said, staring down at her hands. "I tried to tell everyone. Nobody believed me." Chief Rivera, a stocky man with salt and pepper hair and tired eyes, exchanged a glance with Officer Reyes. "We need to check out this shed," he said. The sun was setting by the time they arrived at Elder Montgomery's property. Yellow police tape surrounded the house, but curious neighbors still stood on their porches watching. News vans from the nearest city had begun to arrive. "It's back there," Amara said, pointing toward the garden. She hadn't been here in 15 years, but it all looked exactly the same. The perfect lawn, the flower beds bursting with color, the stone path leading to the shed half hidden by tall hedges. "Stay close," Chief Rivera told her as they approached the shed. Two officers in protective gear walked ahead of them, sweeping the area for any creatures that might have escaped from the funeral home. The garden shed looked ordinary enough from the outside. Weathered wood painted a fading green, a small window with a faded checked curtain, a door with a simple padlock. One of the officers broke the lock with bolt cutters, then stepped back, allowing Chief Rivera to push the door open with a gloved hand. Inside was exactly what you'd expect. Gardening tools hanging on walls, bags of soil and fertilizer stacked. In corners, clay pots of various sizes arranged on shelves. Nothing unusual. "The trapdoor is under the workbench," Amara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Officer Reyes moved the workbench aside, revealing a section of flooring that was slightly different from the rest. A small metal ring was embedded in one board, nearly invisible unless you knew what to look for. "Stand back," Chief Rivera ordered, drawing his weapon as Officer Reyes pulled on the ring. The trapdoor lifted with surprising ease, revealing a set of narrow stairs descending into darkness. A smell wafted up from below, musty and strange, like nothing any of them had ever encountered before. "We need more light," Chief Rivera said, his flashlight beam disappearing into the blackness below. Powerful flashlights were brought from police cars. With Chief Rivera leading, they descended the stairs one by one. Amara went last, each step feeling like a journey back into her nightmares. The hidden room was larger than she remembered, stretching beneath not just the shed but beyond, under the garden itself. The walls were lined with glass terrariums and aquariums just as she had described. But what shocked everyone, even Amara, was that many of them were still occupied. Snakes of all sizes coiled behind glass, their scales gleaming in the flashlight beams. Scorpions scuttled across sand in smaller enclosures. There were spiders, lizards, and creatures none of them could identify. Some of the tanks were labeled with names in a script none of them recognized. "Good Lord," breathed Officer Reyes, his flashlight beam landing on a particularly large snake with diamond-patterned scales. "That's a diamondback rattlesnake, highly venomous." "And that's a black mamba," said one of the other officers, pointing to a slender, dark snake in another tank. "Where did he get these? Most of these aren't native to this part of the country." But the creatures were just the beginning. As they moved deeper into the room, their lights revealed shelves lined with jars containing liquids and substances none of them wanted to identify. There were books, dozens of them, bound in materials that made Amara's skin crawl. On a large stone table in the center of the room lay tools, knives with curved blades, bowls carved from what looked like bone, and a collection of small cloth dolls similar to those found in the casket. "Chief," called one of the officers from a far corner, "you need to see this." They gathered around what appeared to be a filing cabinet. Inside were folders containing newspaper clippings, most of them yellowed with age. The headlines jumped out in the flashlight beams. "Local teen missing. Search continues for college student. Hiker vanishes without a trace." "These go back decades," Chief Rivera said, leafing through the folders. "All missing persons cases from this county and the surrounding areas." Officer Reyes picked up one folder that was newer than the others. Inside was a photograph of a young, woman with a bright smile. "This is Lily Wong," he said quietly. "She disappeared 3 years ago while hiking near the river. We never found her." Amara felt cold despite the stuffiness of the underground room. "He collected them," she whispered. "Just like he collected the creatures." Chief Rivera closed the filing cabinet with a snap. "We need forensics down here, now." He turned to Amara, his face grim in the harsh light. "You were right all along, and I'm sorry no one believed you." The next few hours passed in a blur. More police arrived. People in hazmat suits came to deal with the creatures. Crime scene technicians photographed everything, cataloged evidence, took samples. Reporters gathered at the edge of the property, their cameras flashing like lightning. Amara watched it all from a distance, sitting on a garden bench beneath an old oak tree. The truth was finally coming to light, but it brought her no joy, only a deep, aching sadness for all the victims whose files they had found. As night fell completely, Professor Hamid from the local community college arrived. He was an expert in religious studies and folklore, called in by Chief Rivera to make sense of the symbols and artifacts they had found. "This is troubling," he said after examining some of the books. He had joined Amara on the bench, his hands trembling slightly as he flipped through his notes. "Your grandfather appears to have been practicing a very ancient and obscure tradition. It involves using creatures, especially venomous ones, as vessels for power." "Vessels?" Amara asked. Professor Hamid nodded, his face serious in the glow of the police lights. "According to these beliefs, certain animals can hold spiritual energy. The practitioner transfers part of themselves into these creatures, creating a kind of backup, for lack of a better term. Officer Reyes had joined them, his uniform dusty from hours in the hidden room. "Are you saying Elder Montgomery put pieces of himself into those snakes and scorpions?" "That appears to be the case," Professor Hamid replied. "And according to these traditions, when the practitioner dies, the creatures are supposed to be buried with them, allowing all the pieces to reunite in the afterlife. But that didn't happen," Amara said, understanding dawning. "The funeral home didn't know about his plans. They prepared his body normally." "Exactly," said the professor. "The ritual was interrupted, and what happened at the funeral home today may have been the consequences of that interruption." Officer Reyes ran a hand through his hair. "So what now? Is it over?" Professor Hamid looked toward the house where forensics teams were still working. "I don't think so. Not yet. The ritual was incomplete, and from what I've seen in these books, that means something is still unsettled." As if in response to his words, the lights in Elder Montgomery's house suddenly went out. Then the street lights along Cherry Blossom Lane flickered and died, one by one, plunging the neighborhood into darkness. In that darkness, only the emergency lights from police vehicles provided any illumination. And in that strange, blue-tinted glow, Amara thought she saw something moving across her grandfather's perfectly manicured lawn, something that wasn't quite a shadow, but wasn't solid either. "We need to complete the ritual," she said suddenly, standing up. "We need to end this properly." Officer Reyes looked at her like she had lost her mind. "What are you talking about?" "If we don't," she replied, watching as more shadows gathered around the house. "What happened at the funeral home will seem like nothing compared to what's coming." The skies above Meridian Creek turned an unnatural shade of green as dawn broke the next day. People stood on their porches, looking up in confusion and fear. No weather forecast had predicted the strange storm clouds that now hung low over the town, particularly centered above Cherry Blossom Lane. At Elder Montgomery's house, a small group had gathered to do something none of them had ever imagined. Amara stood in the garden, her face pale but determined. Beside her, Professor Hamid was reviewing his notes one last time. Officer Reyes and Chief Rivera watched nervously, their hands never far from their weapons. They had been up all night preparing. "Are you sure about this?" Chief Rivera asked for what must have been the 10th time. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," Amara replied softly. "The professor has checked every book we found. The Ritual has to be completed. After long discussions and heated debates, they had agreed on a plan. Elder Montgomery's body had been moved from the funeral home to the garden shed. The creatures that had survived, collected carefully by animal control experts from both the funeral home and the hidden room, were now in secure containers nearby. "This goes against everything I believe in," muttered Pastor Williams, who had insisted on being present despite everyone's concerns. The elderly man stood a safe distance away, his prayer book clutched tightly in his hands. "But I've seen enough to know that something unholy is at work here." Unholy was the right word. Since the incident at the funeral, strange things had been happening all over town. Electrical systems failing, water turning briefly brown before clearing again, animals behaving oddly, birds flying in perfect circles, dogs howling at nothing. And the dreams. Everyone reported the same nightmare of Elder Montgomery standing at the foot of their beds, his mouth moving but no sounds coming out. Something had been unleashed when the casket opened, something that needed to be put right. "It's time," Professor Hamid said, checking his watch. "The sun is at the right position." They moved as a group toward the garden shed. The air felt thick, almost hard to walk through. Shadows seemed to stretch in impossible directions, and more than once, Amara was certain she saw something moving just at the edge of her vision. Inside the shed, Elder Montgomery's body lay on a simple table they had constructed according to the professor's instructions. Around it, symbols had been drawn using chalk on the wooden floor. Not the original dark symbols from the hidden room, but cleaner, simpler versions that Professor Hamid assured them would help complete the ritual without embracing its darker aspects. "We're not trying to follow his path," the professor had explained. "We're trying to close a door that was left open." Chief Rivera nodded to one of his officers standing by the door. "Bring them in." 2 animal control officers entered, carrying secure containers that held the collected creatures. With extreme caution, they placed these containers around the table according to Professor Hamid's directions. "Now I need everyone to step back," the professor said. "Amara and I will handle the rest." Chief Rivera looked uncomfortable but motioned for everyone to move away. "You have 10 minutes, he told them. "Then we're pulling the plug on this ritual, or no ritual." Once the shed had emptied except for Amara and the professor, they looked at each other nervously. "Are you ready?" he asked. Amara nodded, though ready was the last thing she felt. "What do we do?" "According to the text, you need to speak the words. You're his blood relative. The connection is strongest through you." Professor Hamid handed her a piece of paper on which he had written several lines of text. The words were in English but arranged in a way that felt ancient and strange. "Read this, and then we'll release the creatures." Amara took a deep breath and began to read. "Bearer of secrets, keeper of knowledge hidden from light, your journey is incomplete. These vessels of your spirit return to you now. Accept them and find your rest." As she spoke, the air in the shed grew even thicker. The shadows in the corners deepened, taking on shapes that made her want to look away. The temperature dropped until she could see her breath forming small clouds with each word. "Through these creatures, your scattered essence reunites. What was divided becomes whole again. What was hidden is revealed and then laid to rest." A low humming sound filled the small space, like distant bees or power lines overloaded with current. The containers holding the creatures began to vibrate. "Your path ends here. Your secrets end here. Your power returns to the earth from which it came." Professor Hamid nodded encouragingly as she reached the final words. "By blood and truth, I close this circle. By light and air, I seal this passage. What was opened now closes forever." The moment she finished speaking, Professor Hamid moved quickly, opening the secure containers one by one. Snakes, scorpions, and spiders poured out. But instead of scattering, across the floor as expected, they moved with purpose, straight toward Elder Montgomery's body. Amara stepped back, watching in horrified fascination as the creatures crawled onto the still form, covering it like a living blanket. The humming sound grew louder, and the shadows in the corners of the room began to swirl and coalesce. "Is this supposed to happen?" she whispered. Professor Hamid's eyes were wide behind his glasses. The texts weren't specific about this part. The swirling shadows gathered above the body, forming a shape that was almost human but not quite, elongated and twisted, like a reflection in a warped mirror. It hovered there for a moment, and then, with a sound like a sigh, it descended onto the creature-covered form. The humming stopped abruptly. The temperature began to rise, returning to normal, and one by one the creatures stopped moving. When the last of them grew still, the shadows that had filled the corners of the room dissipated, leaving only ordinary darkness. "Is it over?" Amara asked, her voice shaking. Before Professor Hamid could answer, the door burst open. Chief Rivera and Officer Reyes rushed in, weapons drawn. "What happened?" the chief demanded. "The whole shed was glowing from the outside, I think," Professor Hamid said slowly, looking at the now still body and creatures. "We just witnessed the completion of a very ancient ritual. Outside, townspeople were pointing at the sky. The strange green clouds had begun to disperse, revealing patches of ordinary blue. The oppressive feeling that had hung over Meridian Creek was lifting like morning fog. In the days that followed, things slowly returned to normal. Elder Montgomery was buried in a simple private ceremony, far from the family plot in the town cemetery. The hidden room beneath the garden shed was thoroughly investigated, leading to the resolution of 12 missing persons cases dating back over 30 years. The town was shocked, horrified, and then, gradually, began to heal. Amara stayed in Meridian Creek longer than she had planned. There were statements to give, questions to answer, and a family history to reckon with. Her family, once they got over their initial disbelief and denial, needed her, not just for the investigation, but to help them process what had happened, to understand how someone they thought they knew could have hidden such darkness. 6 months. Later, Amara stood at the edge of what had once been her grandfather's property. The house had been demolished. The ground had been cleared. Nothing remained of the garden, the shed, or the hidden room beneath. "What will you do with it?" asked Officer Reyes, Luis, as she now called him, who stood beside her. Amara looked out over the empty space, seeing not what had been but what could be. "Something good," she said. "Something healing." The plans were already drawn up. A small community center for survivors of abuse and trauma. A place where people could tell their stories and be believed. A place where secrets could be brought into the light. "The foundation will be poured next week," she said. Luis took her hand, a gesture that had become familiar over the past months as they'd worked together to unravel her grandfather's legacy. "From darkness to light," he said. Amara nodded, squeezing his hand. "From secrets to truth." In the distance, the town of Meridian Creek continued its daily business. People still talked about the snake funeral and the shocking revelations that followed. Parents still warned children not to wander near Cherry Blossom Lane after dark. Some claimed they could still feel something strange in the air when they passed by the empty lot. But for Amara, standing on what had once been poisoned ground, the air felt clean and new. The burden she had carried since she was 13 had finally been set down. The truth had been revealed, the past acknowledged, and now, at last, a new story could begin. One without snakes or scorpions or shadows. One that she would write herself.